All right, well, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today for evidence-based writing in the science classroom.
My name is Sarah Ballou Welch. I am the secondary ELA specialist here with the Georgia Department of Education. I believe we have Dr. Brianne Houston on here, who is our ELA program manager as well. And I have been here since June 1st. This is my first foray into the world of GoToWebinar, so please forgive any lapses on my part going in. I am the ELA person, but I'm trying really hard to represent the science side today, so I am super excited about this workshop.
Oh, that's right. Thank you, Sarah. And I know the GoToWebinar says my name is Amanda Bice. I am not Amanda Bice. I am Keith Crandall. I'm the science program specialist. Our emails are here on the screen, so please reach out if you are thinking about this session, days from now or later today, and have questions or comments about it. Reach out. We are here to support you. And as you think about the classroom this next year and going back and working with students again, we want to make sure we support you in any way possible. All right, so what we're talking about today, we have this session we're going to kind of split it into two pieces. So the first is the main session. We're just really going to dig into the elements of argumentative writing in science. And then towards the end of this, we're going to have a wonderful time. We've set aside for more of a workshop kind of format where we can work together and kind of bounce ideas off of each other, use some of the resources we're going to talk about today, and really put them into practice where you can use them hopefully in your classroom several weeks from now. So again, thank you for joining us, and we are excited to be with you this morning.
And knowing that a lot of you are science, more science background, in the chat box, I popped a link for just a Slido just for you to enter one word about when you think of argumentative writing, what do you think of as a feature of the genre, or what do you think of as something people need? And so it's just to sort of figure out moving into it, where we are. Even if you're, again, from the ELA side, which represent, what do you think of when you think of argumentative writing? So far I'm seeing evidence, claim, definite features. And you can type in another claim. Claim is a big part of it. That's sort of, at the heart. If you don't have a claim, you don't have argumentative writing. Evidence positions, you take that position. So your responses that you're putting in there are totally aligned with what argumentative writing is, its very nature. So before we even really get started, what is it? Argumentative writing entails a clear position. So you take that, which is what you guys are saying in your comments, supported by detailed, accurate evidence, again, from your comments, with well-reasoned explanations. So this was something that always came up in my English side, argumentative essays in the classroom, because I could have kids all day long who would have a position and they would have evidence. And then they would sometimes miss that crucial third piece where you make the connection. But that's really what helps turn argumentative into what it is. But at the same time, it's knowing what is it not. So whenever we say, what is it not, then, it's not a debate. So I used to say, don't be a fence sitter. Where you can use counterclaim, you're not going to go through and say, it's this and it's that. You pick a position, you support it. Argumentative writing, as much as some people might like to do it, is not the opportunity just to label anyone who disagrees with you as a jerk. You're just talking about yours, which, I was a middle school teacher, so that was always a place that was easy sometimes for students to go. It's not explanatory. I mean, it is. There are elements of explanation, but they're all in service of that argument, and it's not just a narrative or a story. So it's really its own separate genre. So it's just that understanding of what we're looking at before we jump in.
That's great, Sarah, and great responses on that poll. Really great responses, and that's so true. I think one thing as far as science teachers go is we have this piece in our science standards that we're going to be digging into, and a lot of teachers first thought, well, maybe this argument thing is a debate, and that's so true. That has to have those features that we've talked about this morning already. So when it comes to science, and a lot of our people on the call this morning have seen this before, but those maybe newer to this or maybe on closer to the ELA side, in science we start with a phenomenon. So we're not going to start the class by saying, hey, today students, we're going to argue about this topic or this topic. No, of course not. We're going to start with a phenomenon. So we're used to seeing that word in everyday language, but when it comes to science classrooms here in Georgia, a phenomenon is simply an event or something that can be observed, and the students then explain or try and predict with it. So the goal of our science classrooms is that students are constructing their knowledge as they can explain and predict a phenomenon. Maybe it's a demonstration that the teacher does in the classroom, or perhaps it's a video from somewhere else, or even some pictures, or even some data by itself could be a phenomenon. If you are not familiar with the Georgia Science Teachers Association, they have a phenomenon bank. It is free to use. It's wonderful because it aligns everything by the science course or the grade, and you can see phenomena that have worked in Georgia science classrooms that are all submitted by Georgia science teachers. An excellent, excellent resource. So that's where we are. We're going to start with a phenomenon, and this gives us that piece, that essential component in a science room to give students something to argue about. So here's an example about the swamp fires in the Okefenokee. So you see our biology standard here, SB5, where we are talking about the environment and how organisms are interdependent of each other. And the particular piece, as an example, would be this part here, where we are constructing an argument to predict the impact of environmental change on the stability of an ecosystem. So a great example would be one of the biggest swamp fires in 2007, where thousands and thousands of acres were burned. And so the phenomenon, or the piece where students are going to be arguing about, is what happens to an ecosystem with a swamp fire? How can we have such a big fire in a swamp? Many students may think this is impossible since a swamp is wet, but they construct an argument based on this. So this would be the lead-in. So the phenomenon really would start the science unit where students are presented with this. Maybe it's pictures and videos, or perhaps reading a story like from an online source about how this happened and maybe what happened. And then from there, they start building that science knowledge as they explain the phenomenon. So again, the concept of environmental change doesn't lead the lesson, the phenomenon does. And that provides students something to argue about. And here we go. Science and ELA standards are BFFs.
Well, as Keith was saying, we are definitely BFFs in this. And even if you look at the language of our standards, you can see it's sort of the highlighting in red here, which is the communicate piece in the science standards. And these are paralleled. So in second grade, you can see how it bleeds over. In seventh grade, it's the same thing. And then in high school. So everything between the two is really supportive. And in fact, in one of our ELA standards for second grade, and it talks about participating in writing projects where you record science observations, which is part of the obtain information from the science. So realistically, what Keith was talking about when he talked about the phenomenon as a way to get kids to enter that gateway in science, ELA teachers could also use that. As we, have some sort of content area discussions or content area integrations, because when we look for things to engage our students, we're looking at things to get them writing. And these scientific phenomenon are fascinating, and it's something that they can really sink their teeth into while also supporting those other grade level standards. And so Keith, you may have more to add here.
I do, that's right. And there is so much crossover at each grade band where where teachers can really work together and maybe perhaps work with folks across the building to support students. And you can see so many commonalities here that students, in essence, we're asking them to do a lot of the same things in their ELA class as their science class. And how supportive could we be of students if we start to work together and bring some of these things together for them? So those of you kind of maybe newer to the science part of things, I do want to take a minute and talk about our science standard construction. So one unique thing about our science standards is that every standard, kindergarten through 12th grade, begins with the science practice of obtain, evaluate, and communicate information. So as far as literacy goes, we have literacy baked into all of our science standards. And what a cool thing to have in common that students are obtaining, evaluating, and communicating in every grade band in every course. Whether that's high school physics or whether that's first grade, they still are obtaining, evaluating, and communicating. So for science, this is built in. And you can see here how the individual standard element starts with a science practice. So the science practice, we kind of refer to that as the how students are going to be engaging with that particular content. Now the what, that's the core idea, the content, what students will be learning about. And in many cases, this didn't change much from our previous standards to now, but the difference is how we've put in the science and engineering practice. And importantly, is to start with that phenomenon. Again, the content doesn't lead students by itself. If we told students to develop an argument about environmental change, they may really not know what to do with that. However, if we lead with that phenomenon of the case of the swamp fire, for an example, now they have something to argue about. They have a reason to build that science knowledge. So although it can be easy for us science teachers to sometimes skip over that science practice and get right to that standard and say, well, what do my students have to know for the standard? What do my students have to be able to do for this standard? But it's important to pause and think about how the science practice plays into what's going to happen in the classroom. It's not all about the content. See, our students are really being scientists and engineers as they go through our science courses, grade by grade or course by course. Now, you also notice some color coding here. So we have 8 science and engineering practices. Now, one of the cool things is the same 8 science and engineering practices exist kindergarten through high school. So students are going to be developing models in elementary school, middle school, and high school. So although they look different from course to course or by grade band, they have this commonality. So you can see as we're talking about argument today, that's one way students are evaluating and communicating information. They are engaging in that science content, but also they're communicating that argument. They're evaluating information as they develop that argument. And so there's a lot of crossover here with what you saw on that ELA slide. But as far as science goes, for those of you maybe newer to science, these are the 8 science practices that are built in to each and every one of our science standards. Again, easy to skip over at times, but it really is a critical role in how the students are engaged in their science classrooms. And so what all these things mean. So we have these standards that are constructed with science practices and that kind of thing. But as far as the classroom goes, a science classroom in Georgia with these standards might look a little different than a science classroom that we as teachers were when we were students. But I like to say the role of the student and the role of the teacher kind of got flipped. In other words, the teacher, we're facilitating, we're coaching students through science content. The role of the student is really elevated. The student's role is where they are synthesizing information. They are investigating. They are communicating as they go through and explain that phenomenon. And you can see here that communicate piece is so huge. Can they develop an argument? Can they develop an explanation about those things they are learning about or that phenomenon they are trying to predict or explain? Again, the role of the student is really elevated. And so this morning we want to dig into the particular piece of how can we have students, how can we support students with argumentation in a science classroom?
And part of that is going to be using mentor text. So if you have not used mentor text in your science classroom, they are a great way to help model for students, because we know, especially when you get into a lot of the theory around visible learning or visible learning in science, a huge part of it for students is not just sort of seeing the theory, but it's seeing things put into practice and seeing those exemplars. And so we've just embedded some resources throughout these slides to help you, and that's an article that will assist a lot. But Keith, if you'll go on to the next slide, I'll talk about, these are just some text tips for science. So whenever we talk about mentor text, we want to show students what we want them to write, and we want to show them what we consider strong models. And that takes out some of the guesswork for them as far as what they, they're using all of their brain power to try to figure out if this is something good. We say, this is a good model, this is an exemplar, and then let them try to figure out what's good about it. So before you even have students write an argumentative piece, you might find an argumentative piece about a topic you're studying and give it to students and just let them annotate, just let them take notes, let them have those discussions about, what does this do well? What about this makes it argumentative? And so sometimes we know, textbooks, they're going to see, that chapter and get overwhelmed, but you can try some different types of text, articles, op-eds. You could even show videos, or you could have a shorter piece to show them an infographic and focus on one certain skill to let them analyze that. And again, just sort of using those mentor text and providing them for students helps give them that platform, that model, to feel more confident in their own writing. Because as we talk more about the writing process, we're going to discuss student confidence even more, because writing is an area where students, adults, really everyone can feel a certain amount of vulnerability. And so it's really important in the process that we help give them the supports to feel confident about what they're writing. And when we do that, they're going to be a lot more likely to help us see that scientific reasoning behind what's going on.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, excellent tips.
And going back, thank you, Keith, to what we were discussing as far as what does it look like? How does this fit with science? The next few slides, we're going to talk about those words that you put in that Slido earlier, that evidence, that claim, that evaluation, the reasoning. But it's also really important as you start constructing these assignments to maybe think about having authentic audience and authentic purpose. And for science, that fits in so easily. And that, everything that I've seen in the past few years involving science investigations, involving STEM, whenever there is a community source or community panel or some sort of other audience for the work that comes in, that really helps up the urgency and the buy-in from the students, or having that authentic purpose if they're conducting research on an issue in your community and being able to share it. And so they're able to take all of these argumentative elements and put them in with something that really matters to them and really matters to the people around them, and that helps strengthen everything that they put in. So if we want to jump into some of those terms now.
Yeah, let's.
First up, and this is the number one thing that you guys had repeated votes on the Slido, is that claim, is the position. So the key part of claim in any argument is that you take a position and clearly state it. It doesn't have to be super complicated. And I think sometimes with older students, they get caught up in the fact that they need that compound, complex sentence that hits 8 different bullet points. But in all truth, a direct claim does not have to be super complicated. It can be simple and it can be strong. And so that, can make a huge difference. But the part about a claim is if it's just a claim, it cannot stand alone. So for instance, I've had exceptionally bad luck with natural disasters over the past year, making this phenomenon quite the topic. So I've had to submit 2 different claims to my homeowner's insurance. And when I've done that, I've had to submit evidence or they are not going to pay because it's an unsubstantiated claim. And this exact same thing happens with our argumentative writing. So the actual science standard is up here to construct an argument to predict the impact of environmental change on the stability of an ecosystem. Well, that is kind of coming down to the main prompt. How can a fire in the Okefenokee Swamp change the ecosystem? Which, just putting all this out there, I don't know how many of you are swamp wise. You guys went through Okefenokee Joe years ago. I learned a lot about the Okefenokee through that program, but all it's looking for is essentially a yes or a no. Okay, like there has to be an impact or there's not an impact. So fires in the Okefenokee Swamp alter its ecosystem, and then I went ahead and set up the main 2 cruxes of my argument through the destruction of vegetation and the subsequent relocation of wildlife. Also, not a scientific person wrote this. Do not judge Keith for any of this.
Not at all.
Send it on my way. But I've taken a stand. There was a position that it has changed through these 2 ways. And so the claim could have been, it could be even more simplified than that. But as long as they take a position and they clearly state it. Something that would not be a claim would be something like if they said a fire could change the Okefenokee Swamp, but also it stays the same. And I say that because I've seen a lot of things like that in student writing.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Well, I really like how you worded it here, Sarah, about a claim. It's a promise to the reader. And that may not be a complicated statement, but it is a promise, which what a great way to communicate with our students that, if you're going to write a claim, you're going to promise to other students, to me, to others who are going to see or read this, that you're going to back this up. And what a neat way to kind of to word that, just to remind students that you're right. It's not just a on the fence kind of a statement. You need to be a clear statement with a position. I really like the way you worded that.
I believe in the claim promise. And it typically makes it easier for kids when you word it like that, because then they know they have to come back and support it, which leads us into the next piece, our evidence. So the big thing about evidence is that it needs to be relevant to what we're doing, and it also needs to be persuasive. So there are different kinds of evidence. So if you have students involved in active research projects, of course, they can use their research to support their claims. Facts, statistics, expert testimony, anecdotal observations. So something that they've noticed, it's the fact that what they've seen has value too. And so it helps them realize that they are, in this case, scientists in the making. What they've observed has value. And so all of these are different kinds of evidence they can weave together to support their arguments. And so I made a little note here, crafting ethos, because one thing is when they're doing this, they do want to have that persona of authority and respectability. That's part of crafting an argument. You want someone to believe you. And so in the upper grades, citing that evidence, how do you want them to do that? I just made the note that as appropriate by grade level, that would maybe be an additional skill to bring in, however you wanted to do that. For the particular claim that I just made, I tried to show both a direct quote and then some paraphrasing taken from this source, which was the AJC article. And again, whatever evidence I choose needs to directly support the claim I made, because sometimes students get a little confused and they make a claim and then they just pick anything in the article that has numbers. Or they pick, this looks like evidence, and they pull it in, but they don't match. And so really helping students see that it all has to go together, and they're like the pieces of a puzzle. will really make a difference in the quality and the strength of those argumentative essays or writing tasks.
That's great. I really like what you said here about expert testimony, Sarah, because with our science standards, our science practices, really, we try and put students, no matter what grade band they're in the role of scientist or engineer. And you mentioned earlier about how neat could that be if students are learning about figuring out things that are right there in their community. And so this phenomenon piece plays a role here too, because if we're talking about something in their community or something they perhaps have seen or read about, they are bringing that evidence forward as the scientist or as the expert in that scenario. So great point here, really great points.
And the last, it sort of leads us into what we were saying before about you can have the claim, you can have evidence, but this is where the students really need to make their thinking explicit. You know, they have chosen this evidence hypothetically for a reason to back up their claim, but now they need to explain to the reader what the role of that evidence is in supporting their claim. So they have to explain, why does this evidence support this claim? So on this one, I tried to tie together, based on the evidence of the widespread burning of habitat and reports of animals fleeing the fire, we know that the Okefenokee ecosystem changes in the wake of large-scale swamp fires. Swamp fires. But it's using especially the CER strategy, or SARE, which is also, you know, very common with science. So we'll look at that in just a second. This would be a good place where if you've ever used an anchor chart and you're working your way through the curriculum and you have those, you know, for your first unit, maybe you have broken down an argumentative topic and you have it up. Saving examples of student work to serve as exemplars in future units, in future years, that is one of the most valuable things I ever did in the classroom, was having those student pieces, those exemplars. So when students are like a little bit confused, they can see a number of different ways someone tackled the assignment just to get their thoughts going. And it can be about different topics. They can still see the organization and the structure.
That's right. And that's one of those things when I was in the classroom, it was always valuable for me to see when students started developing arguments, if they were doing a CER strategy or another, it was really neat to see how their own skill set would grow as the school year went on. Whereas beginning of the year and with younger students too, they kind of get stuck sometimes on this reasoning piece of, okay, well, there's my evidence and I'm done, right? Well, no, we need to make sure we have, okay, where's the why? You know, this statement here that connects it all together. And so, yeah, saving those work examples is huge, and students can see, even if they're keeping their own work samples, they can see, you know, the beginning of the year or their first semester, how they have improved in their writing skill and that communication piece with developing an argument.
And if you're doing STEM journals or science journals and they're keeping it all together, it is a really great way to go back and look at a portfolio, you know, at the end of the year, or it's a great piece for parent-teacher conferences to be able to sort of show or to have students talk about their growth. And it's just that foundational document.
That's right.
Counterclaim. Counterclaim is where a lot of good essays or good writing assignments go wrong. And the reason is, when students, I've noticed, get into counterclaim, they suddenly go from a cohesive argument and then they jump into something like they essentially just argue for the other side and they lose all of their argumentative properties. And so I sort of mapped out what I thought were the 4 steps of counterclaim. First, they have to identify the opposition viewpoint. They have to point out essentially that they are wrong. They have to follow that with what the evidence shows, leading into, again, why they are still right. Counterclaim is a strong rhetorical device, and it can add so much to what they're doing, but they have to understand how to structure it and how to do it. The key is to crush them respectfully. That's how I put it here.
I like that.
So it's hard. I would do counterclaim, just sort of drills in my class, because it was so confusing sometimes to students, because this is where they wanted to get into, you know, natural disasters can affect the environment, but they also cannot affect the environment. And that's what they wanted to do, which is when it sort of went awry. So it's the fact that you know the opposition viewpoint, you prove why they're wrong, you come back to why you are right, respectfully. So while some may argue that environmental changes such as fire do not impact the stability of a local ecosystem, so that's the opposition's viewpoint, the fact that various species of animals entirely vacate their living space makes that claim specious. That's why they are wrong. Many animals cannot continue to live in a fire-devastated wasteland because their food source has disappeared. That's what the evidence shows, which I actually colored back to evidence, because counterclaim is kind of a mixture of explanation and evidence. And then sort of the end, the evidence of various species relocation proves that environmental changes impact the ecosystem. Coming back to why I am right. So this is probably not a step-by-step process you would see anywhere else, but that is a breakdown of the composition of a counterclaim to hopefully try to strengthen their arguments and help them win all the fights with their parents, which was the big selling point for me teaching counterclaim.
Oh, that's great. They listen then, I bet. That's funny.
Yes, it is. It is. I'm like, okay, today we're going to learn how to win every argument with your parents. And they were in because it was an authentic purpose.
I love it. But I love how it connects back to the evidence. Again, it's bringing back the evidence, and they have to prove it with evidence. It's not just one student yelling louder than another. Absolutely not. They have to use the evidence and give that reasoning as clearly as this example. That's great.
So the strategy is when we put it all together. And so essentially, all of those pieces that I just had, we would put into one cohesive paragraph. Claim, evidence, reasoning, and sort of drilling that CER into their heads will really help them through the writing process and with new tasks. So it becomes something they are comfortable with as a guide. And then we get into grading, which is always the question. I'm going to tell you that I have spent weeks, and I mean, if you add all the time up of the time that I spent providing student feedback, I can't even put a number on it. The big thing about student feedback, and I'll talk more about this in a second, is that it's actionable. And part of that happens through our grading process. And so I know rubrics have had a lot of ground. So we have a few potential rubrics that we've pulled. And then, Keith, do you want to talk about the engaging an argument tool?
Right, and I think we have some time to pull both of these up that we can look at. So, for example, the engaging an argument from evidence. So that is that science practice that we've been talking about. And in this folder, and again, like Sarah mentioned earlier, we're going to be sharing the slides with everyone here today, so you'll have the links and you will have all the resources we talked about. So maybe kind of hard to see right here, but in this particular resource, in the engaging an argument, is we are talking about the science practice of engaging an argument. And this is from a document that's all about science practices. So the document is linked in the slides, and it goes through all 8 science practices, what it can look like in a classroom. But I think one of the best parts about it is it breaks down each grade band, K2, 3, 5, 6, 8, and then 9, 12, about that specific science practice. An argument's going to look different in high school than it will in middle school, of course, and elementary as well. But a great tool we can use when we start thinking about, okay, so our students are going through the claim evidence reasoning process with an argument, how can we start to pull in the pieces where we're going to build their score, maybe build a rubric or think about their scoring. This is a document that kind of shows some examples of what we can expect those grade bands to do. So for example, maybe in middle school, students are providing and receiving critiques about one's explanations or procedures or models. They're citing relevant evidence and posing and responding to questions that elicit pertinent elaboration and detail. So we could take these pieces here to help build a rubric. These pieces here could also be a good discussion point with students, knowing that, okay, guys, here in high school, we've been seeing this engaging in argument practice in our science classrooms for a while. Here are some of the skills and some of the things we should be able to do as we are explaining and predicting that phenomenon. So again, the resources link, this is an excellent tool for us to refer to as we are building those rubrics and digging deeper into the practice of developing an argument. And Sarah, do you want to pull up the rubric bank also?
We could skip pulling up the rubric bank, but that is just a collection of rubrics from essentially across the internet that you may choose to use parts of. But if you would pull open the Learning Target rubric sample.
Yes.
In your lessons, if you have set them up with learning targets, and I'm going to turn my camera on for just a second. I did take off the goggles because I felt like my brain was being squished a little. I've been in a book group with Chris Tavani, and so we've been studying the Why Do I Have to Read This?, which is literacy strategies to engage our most reluctant readers. But that actually applies here as well, because when you're in your standards, or whatever the focus is for your lesson, you can take those pieces and actually turn them into a rubric. And honestly, I will say, looking back for me, one of the things that I wish I had done better is thinking about my rubrics. I had kids who probably did not understand. No, I had kids who did not understand pieces in the rubric, so they didn't really understand how I was grading them. So one strategy is that if you do have a more elaborate rubric, you could give it to students as a ticket out the door and say, I want you to just put your name on it. I want you to circle any words that you don't know. I want you to write any comments about what you would like to know more about or you don't know. The next day, you could actually turn that into a mini lesson to make sure everyone understands what is being asked of him or her. Now, if you have learning targets that are driving your instruction in the class every day, those could then be turned into this science learning target. And so I tried to set this one up, but again, it would be very flexible. And it's set up into two areas. And one is editing as a courtesy to the reader. And that's where you get into the capitalize, punctuate, spelling. It's not saying I'm going to go into pronoun antecedent agreement, which was probably the bane of my some of my AP students' existence for a while. But it's saying I can maintain a respectful, authoritative tone, which is part of argumentative writing. I can cite credible sources correctly and give credit to the original thinker. I can demonstrate improvement by attaching drafts. And so that's part of the, what are we grading for? Are we grading for mastery? Are we grading for growth? And whenever we include this element, we're grading for growth a little bit. We're trying to show some of that. Thinking behind the argument, and this is where I just tried to line up those pieces with what we've just talked about. So their learning target for a day might be, I can describe an issue surrounding a scientific topic or text. That could be the day they are researching or performing an experiment and they're able to explain the scenario. I can take a clear position. I can embed relevant qualitative and or quantitative evidence to support my position. I can effectively utilize counterclaim to support my argument, and I can explain how my evidence supports my claim. So sort of breaking up that CER into elements with some support, and then the students would go through and score themselves and the teacher. And it would even give students a place at the bottom. Here's what I want you to know about my process. So that's the place for them to maybe even communicate with their teacher about what they were thinking. So we can close out of that. But that's just an idea for a possible different kind of rubric that you could use. Because in my work with people in different disciplines, I know that sometimes people get nervous because they say, I'm not an English teacher. That wasn't my thing. I don't know, I don't feel comfortable going in and marking up their writing or looking for run-ons. And the key to something like that would be, it's really trying to emphasize the thinking, but you can also emphasize just those, as a courtesy to your reader, are they hitting those basics? And it really takes some of the stress and the pressure off. And it also will help you get through things probably a lot faster than otherwise. Because again, I know I have spent many hours of my life probably writing comments on essays and papers that were frankly never read. So it's all about making the feedback meaningful and making the rubric work for you to help drive your students' learning.
That's great. Yeah, I really like, Sarah, in that section of those learning target rubric is the section for the student self-reflection, for them to have the opportunity to kind of map out how they're doing on that skill, and then what a great discussion point, what a great formative assessment to bring that piece in. I really like that. And so here again, the next couple of slides, I'm just pulling that argument from evidence from that science and engineering practices for GSE science. And it's linked here. Like I said, it goes to the other science practices too. But again, great resource for us to pinpoint, at least a good starting point for us to know, all right, so I'm in 7th grade science. What can I expect my students to do with an argument in science class? And then we can build learning targets similar to the ones you just saw on this, and do a rubric design with that in mind. So same thing, the skills get more complex as we move into the high school grade band, but they're building off of what they did. So again, the cool thing about the science standards is they're seeing this argument from evidence all the way elementary, middle, and high school. So we support students in that, and you really see the commonality here and how we can bring in what students are doing in their ALA class too.
And Keith, that is so good. I love that document and how easy it would be to maybe take those pieces and turn it into that rubric, or to be the jumping off point for some feedback. So this next little bit is just really looking at feedback strategies. And so this is what I was saying earlier, that feedback is a two-way street. We give it, but unless it was received by the students, truly received, internalized, it did not accomplish its purpose. And so two, pieces to good feedback is that it's actionable. So we give them something that they actually have something to, to do, and they understand what it is they are doing, and also that it's timely. So, when you get sort of super backed up, this is where it comes to the point where you might have to, determine which pieces am I going to provide this feedback on? What are maybe some pieces that we could use peer feedback with? Because you, at the end of the day, are only one human. And even though some students don't believe it, you actually have a life when you leave the school building. You go to the grocery store, it can blow their minds. But to give yourself some, a break in this, just to not necessarily grade every single thing, and then your feedback does not have to be full scale for everything they write. So depending on what it is. So Keith, if you'll click on that tips for conferring in small group, this is whenever you're planning your class sessions. So you might have a mini lesson, and then students might be engaged in something like an experiment or working on something else. And during that time, when the whole class is involved in those more independent projects, this could be where you engage maybe in some small group or some conferencing. So this might be where it was really good to have them annotate that rubric. What do they not understand? Maybe it's that when you were walking around, you noticed that Susie, Johnny, and Heather were all having, they got a position, but it seems like they're really stuck on their evidence. So this is something where for, 5-10 minutes, you might pull them aside and just talk about that evidence, and how do we find that? What are we talking about? And then actually walk them through it. And so this is where some of that differentiation comes into play. It's the same thing on conferencing. What I like about this, and especially with the scientific element, is that you as, a science teacher or as an ELA teacher bringing in students with a scientific topic, you can really get into their thinking about the subject, because honestly, probably where they're getting hung up at is either taking the position in the first place, or it's that final step of the reasoning. It's how they don't understand how to make their thinking explicit to the audience, because they just want to say, because it is, because
right.
it connects. And so it might be the fact that you now have the time to talk them through that process. And as they tell you something, you just say, write it down. And after you go through that one-on-one or small group, it makes enough of an impact that as you go through the year, because these standards keep coming up, they're able to build their own, they build their capacity, and they are able to do that. And it's all about, use your professional discretion. But the hint I will give you is that if you can grow your own horde of writing delegates, it will also take off some of the burden on you having to look at everything. And so those peer workshops can be super valuable. And that may not be something that has happened as much in science, just because, again, so much of what you do might be that hands-on, or it's about, the research or the work. But when it comes to the writing, the first part in developing your horde is just making sure that everyone knows what your expectations are. So all of the students understand, if it's that rubric, maybe you've done a lesson, everybody's been trained for what to look for. A lot of times, if you ask students to go back and look at something, they automatically assume you mean proofread. So they're like, oh yeah, I went back and fixed it. Well, that meant that they capitalized 2 words that were not capitalized before, and they called it done. What they did not do probably was go back and evaluate their own argument. Does this make sense? Is this in an order? Does this evidence go with this claim? And they might not be asking those kinds of questions. So this takes time on the front end, training students how to do that. But after you do it, you can actually use that for the rest of the year. And so what I like to do with that is, if you have an overly confident student in your class, a volunteer, have them come up and model for the class with you as the student leader, and them as the student, using their actual paper. What does this look like? If if it was good for the student and you could film it and just sort of play it for your, a student who was out that day, they would still see what does it look like to really look at one another's papers, to give good feedback. And so it's just another strategy you can use to build your capacity in the classroom, because at that point you go from having one teacher with 26 students or more to, maybe 10 teachers, because, honestly, you're probably going to have students who maybe don't feel as confident with it, but everyone's going to get better and grow. But I think it all comes back to that teacher clarity, which, John Hattie identifies as such a strong influence in student success.
That's right.
And then talking about strategies for disciplinary collaboration. So it's really exciting for me, this, as an ELA person. But I have worked with science teachers in my previous district a lot, as far as how can we work together. And, I just had some ideas for disciplinary collaboration. I know Keith probably has some as well, because we're collaborating right now, because ELA and science are BFFs. But one good thing, and it works either way, and that's what I like, colleague guest speakers. If I were going to, I knew that my students really needed help on informational writing, or I wanted to do argumentative writing with them, but I wanted a topic that connected in with, maybe something we were reading, inviting the chemistry teacher over. I just read The Poisoner's Handbook by Deborah Bloom, who's a Georgia author. It was amazing. And I know that a science teacher at my previous school, they read that in their classroom, and they actually had the author come in to do it as a guest speaker. But that might have been somewhere where they had the author as a guest speaker, and then they have an ELA teacher come in and talk about, structuring that argumentative, but then it remains with the science teacher. Or flip it, science teacher comes into my ELA class and talks about the science to help build that background information. So just working together makes a huge difference.
It does. I think one of the things that's always stuck with me, Sarah, when I was working with science teachers, I was in a particular middle school science teacher's classroom, and they were working on something very similar, where students had to write through an argument about a phenomenon, and I'm just kind of listening to the student conversation, and then one of the students kind of was getting frustrated, and he turns to his neighbor and just kind of was getting a little upset. He goes, "I can't even tell anymore if this is language arts or science class." I'm like, "Oh, this is great. That's perfect." The collaboration was so spot on that the students are doing a lot of the same things. They're not having to completely change the way they write and think and talk when they go from this class to another class. What a cool thing to hear. So yeah, so many strategies for us to work together and kind of work with people from across the building, really to support students.
Yeah, and that's awesome, Keith. That's an awesome comment by a student. And what Keith said earlier about the commonalities between the standards just really lends itself to,
it does.
These assignments where you work together. And so it might be that you co-create, you plan together. Obviously, to pull this off, there has to be some collaborative planning. We had a high school writing center with peer facilitation, and the peer facilitators would go into science classrooms and actually conduct small groups. So it just sort of depends on the resources you have available. And also, as you're planning collaboratively, trying to maybe figure out if you can work in that authentic purpose or authentic audience for what they are writing. And then we have some resources. And
That's
the
right.
resources are here just to help out. So Keith, and then maybe I think we'll almost be to break before we start the actual workshop.
That's right. So any of these you want to show particularly before we move on? Or we can link it up and send it to them.
I think we can just do the link. One of the things, actually, you want to show them your sample sentence frames?
Yeah. And again, all these things are linked in a folder, so you'll have these slides. If you were thinking about this weeks from now or want to share this with a colleague. So I know one thing Sarah and I talked about was using sentence frames as a way to support students. Because again, if they haven't seen a lot of this stuff previously, or as you know, it's been summertime and they get back into things in the fall, they may not automatically jump right into, okay, well, how can I start writing about a claim? Or okay, now I'm on the reasoning piece, but how can I start the reasoning section? So these kind of things really help with supporting students.
And this is just sort of like that we are part of Godot Community, which is the department's newest sort of social media hub, if you will, but it's really a professional learning place for all content areas. And Keith, you want to talk about all the science offerings?
I do, yes. And I just dropped into the to the chat a hyperlink that kind of gives some instructions on how to join these groups. So really the purpose of these groups for science is for us to have science teachers, instructional coaches, and school leadership to be able to connect with others around the state and be able to see some resources and other things that are specific to certain grade bands and science courses. So for science, we have these groups that are here. And again, when we email these slides out, all these things will be linked. So you will have that. And we have science teachers from around the state that are kind of hosting these groups. They share resources and they have sessions. They record their sessions, answer questions. So really, we get to hear from leaders around the state, and they get to share wonderful things from their classroom. So, like Sarah said, this Godot community is kind of a newer space for us, but a great way to connect with others and share the great things that you do in your classroom.
And also a plug, we do have a summer literacy conference coming up, actually July 27th, 28th, 29th. It's Birth to 5 the 27th, K5 on the 28th, and 612 on the 29th, with tons of engaging sessions. This will actually be incorporated into it, but we have so many disciplinary literacy speakers, as well as just sort of the reading and student engagement. So even if you are a science educator, we would love to have you. Please join the community, join our conference group, and then gain access to all of those fantastic resources as well.
That's right. And Sarah, that brings us to the end of our time today. This was really fun working together and seeing some of these examples from our wonderful teachers around the state. And like we said, we will be sharing resources in the slides in case you have colleagues that couldn't make it today, or perhaps there were tech issues earlier. We'll make sure you have those resources for you.
Thank everyone so much for coming and spending your morning with us in what I realize is your summer.